Today, I want to look at Burke Ramsey's emotional distance, sort of a forensic analysis of language, memory, and omission. So let's get into it. At the center of this whole discussion is Burke Ramsey, the older brother of JonBenet Ramsey, and a very specific way he talked or didn't talk about her. We've been circling around this curious lack of emotional weight in his language, especially when he explained why he didn't include her in a drawing of the family. That phrase, "she was gone so I didn't draw her," sits like a brick on the table. On the surface, it's logical, clean, but when you pull it apart, it starts unraveling all kinds of threads about memory, grief, psychological defense, and how we present our internal world to others. And that's where this really takes shape, because we're not just talking about one statement, we're talking about what that kind of statement reveals. What starts to become clear is that the absence of emotion isn't just a quirk, it might be a strategy, and not necessarily a calculated one, but maybe a deeply internalized one. We're dealing with a context where pressure, public scrutiny, and internal family dynamics could all converge in ways that shape how someone communicates. And then add in the idea that Burke was a child at the time, and you start questioning how much of that logic came from survival instinct versus how much of it was absorbed from the environment around him. Because, let's be honest, when families are in crisis, especially under the media spotlight, everyone learns fast what's safe to say. Now, it's easy to say he was just being logical, but logic doesn't usually travel alone. Most people, even when trying to be factual, end up leaking a little emotion, some hesitation, a memory, a metaphor, even an unintended shift in tone. What's odd here is that there's no leak, just a sealed off, efficient conclusion. And that's where forensic psychology and criminology theories come into play. Because when someone skips emotional recall entirely and speaks only in outcomes, we have to start thinking about why that might be happening, not just what's missing, but what the absence itself is doing. This led us into a deeper exploration of several key concepts: emotional flattening, narrative suppression, symbolic omission, cognitive overload, bounded rationality, and psychological insulation. And all of that is a fancy way of saying that sometimes people shape their words not to express truth, but to survive it. And we've looked at how this can happen consciously or unconsciously in response to internal conflict or external pressure. Either way, the outcome is the same: a sentence that sounds simple, but actually holds a lot of tension just beneath the surface. So as we head into the body of this analysis, we're not trying to point fingers or build a case. We're just following the emotional logic, or in this case, the lack of it. We're watching the way grief tries to hide inside reason, and how silence, structure, and even drawings become part of a larger emotional pattern. That's what we're unpacking. Not just a sentence, but what a sentence is doing in the room. 1. The circumstances of the drawing and Burke's own account in the Burke Darkdale transcript. 1 inch from his exclusive interview, it is revealed that just 13 days after JonBenet's tragic murder, Burke, then 9 years old, was asked to draw a picture of his family by a child psychologist. During this session, he drew himself, his mother, and his father, but notably, he did not include JonBenet. Burke himself vaguely recalls this event. When asked by Dr. Phil if this omission was a conscious decision, Burke explained, "I don't really remember what was going through my head, but she was gone, so I didn't draw her." According to The Death of Innocence, the book co-authored by John and Patsy Ramsey, this interview took place on January 8, 1997, at the Child Advocacy Center in Niwot. The Ramseys had agreed to the interview on the condition that it be conducted by a professional trained in dealing with children, not an inexperienced detective. Dr. Suzanne Bernhard, a child psychologist, conducted the interview, while detectives Linda Arndt, Jane Harmer, and Ron Gosage observed from behind a two-way mirror. Burke Ramsey versus CBS corroborates this, stating that Dr. Bernhard concluded in her written report to the Boulder Police Department that it was clear to her that Burke did not witness his sister's murder. The Ramseys noted in The Death of Innocence that Burke, similar to his father John, was naturally introspective and quiet, often appearing indifferent or distant when under intense pressure. Okay, so let's first think about how language can reveal what emotion chooses to hide. When someone experiences something profound, grief, loss, a major disruption, the way they speak about it gives you a pretty good read on how deeply they've internalized it, or maybe how much they've had to repress it just to get through the day. So when Burke says, very matter-of-factly, she was gone, there's something starkly unlayered about that. It's stripped of emotional data. No tone shift, no hesitation, no metaphor or softening. It's sterile, and that sterility almost makes you wonder if it's shielding something or if it's just all there is. And that's where things start to get interesting. And if we start by considering the absence of emotional inflection, it opens up a psychological curiosity. When someone says something like that and it's flat, not just in delivery, but in content, we might be tempted to say it's cold. But before we jump to that word, maybe it's more productive to say it's closed, emotionally closed off. And in some forensic psychology circles, this would be chalked up to emotional dampening or flattening, a phenomenon where someone removes affect because the emotional load is too overwhelming or dissonant. It's like sealing off a leaking pipe because the pressure's too high. But it still matters that the pipe was leaking in the first place. On the same topic, let's think about what it means to process loss cognitively instead of emotionally. When we lose someone, most people talk about the things they miss, the sounds, the routines, the inside jokes, the unexpected little details. But Burke doesn't go there. He offers no memory, no emotional anchor. What he offers instead is a logical substitution. She's not present, so she's not drawn. That's not a memory. That's a process. That's not grieving. That's filtering data through a system that values absence as exclusion. So maybe what we're looking at isn't just emotional silence, it's emotional displacement. And we can also think about how compartmentalization works on a neurophysiological level. There's actually a biological explanation for why people split their emotions from their cognition. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of logic and planning, can sometimes override limbic system responses like sadness or fear. It's a kind of neural override. People who've been through repeated stressors often build that circuit stronger. So when someone answers a question with pure logic in a moment that invites emotion, they may not be suppressing feelings, they may have rerouted how they experience them entirely. It's a brain pattern, not just a personality quirk. Considering that, we might want to look at how language and drawing both reflect internal maps of attachment. When kids draw their families, they're not just listing household members, they're revealing who they're emotionally tuned into, who they feel seen by, who's in their emotional orbit. So for someone to exclude a sibling, not symbolically represent her, not even include a ghost of her through memory or outline, that's not just omission, that's erasure. And erasure doesn't always mean hatred. Sometimes it's avoidance, sometimes it's about memory management, but it's never nothing. Let's think a bit about the philosophical question of moral detachment. In forensic philosophy, there's this idea of epistemic dissonance. Basically, when a person knows something and simultaneously refuses to integrate it into their moral or emotional framework, it's a survival move. A lot of people talk about it in criminology when someone is involved in wrongdoing but frames it in neutral terms. It happened, she's gone, it was a thing that occurred. The less personalized the language, the more that dissonance becomes visible. The more abstract the speech, the more likely it is that emotion has been locked away in a vault. And if we zoom out for a second, this also speaks to how grief is socially expected to show up. There's this unspoken rule that grief has to sound a certain way. If you don't cry, you're suspicious. If you don't break down, people side-eye you. But some people were never taught to emote in that way, or they learn quickly not to. So maybe the flatness in Burke's language isn't proof of guilt, but a clue about what grief looks like in his particular emotional dialect. Still, even in those cases, most people reveal some kind of inner shift. That's what's strange. There's not even a behavioral beat skipped in his retelling. Just she was gone. And in addition to that, let's pull from the criminological framing of neutralization theory. This is the idea that people mentally distance themselves from responsibility or emotion by using certain justifications. Techniques like denial of injury or denial of victim are common, but what's particularly relevant here is the appeal to higher loyalties or denial of responsibility. But imagine applying that not to action, but to emotion. Could someone subconsciously deny emotional responsibility? Could someone feel that remembering or honoring a person is no longer appropriate, and so they neutralize that obligation entirely? What's also interesting is the forensic semiotic lens. Semiotics is the study of signs and symbols, how we communicate meaning. In that sense, a drawing is not just a sketch, it's a narrative. So if someone removes a character from their family drawing, that's a symbolic act. And in a forensic context, symbolism is rarely random. So we have to ask, what's the meaning embedded in that omission? Is it punishment? Is it denial? Is it self-protection? The absence is loaded, and whether intentional or reflexive, it tells a story that language alone won't admit. Okay, now let's touch on theory of mind and social cognition. Kids, especially those around the age Burke was, are developing their theory of mind, meaning their understanding of how others think and feel. If a child lacks a nuanced theory of mind, they may not fully grasp how their words are perceived. That means he may say she was gone and think it's enough, because cognitively it answers the question. Emotionally, though, it leaves a canyon of implication that's totally unacknowledged. And that gap, that's where people feel something's off. If we look again at the flatness, we might also think about alexithymia. That's a fancy word for a condition where someone has difficulty identifying and describing emotions. It doesn't mean they don't feel, it means the emotions don't translate well into words. People with alexithymic tendencies often sound detached or robotic when talking about loss, because they're accessing the world through a primarily logical lens. If this were the case, it could explain the clinical sound of "she was gone" without immediately assuming malice or manipulation. Now, here's something subtle but important. The absence of I. Burke doesn't say "I miss her." He doesn't say "I wish she were here." He doesn't center himself in the emotional equation at all. That detachment from self in relation to other is peculiar, not because everyone has to grieve the same way, but because the first person frame is usually automatic in reflection. We say, "I think, I remember, I feel," but none of that is present. The statement floats unattached to any emotional agent. We can also think about the performative aspect of language. Language doesn't just describe feelings, it performs them. When we say, "I'm heartbroken," we're not just reporting a feeling, we're also conveying to the world that we have feelings, that we're connected to the emotional reality of what occurred. But if someone avoids performative language, intentionally or not, it shuts down emotional reciprocity. And that's what's so startling here. There's no performance, there's no script, there's just function. She was gone. Let's also throw in a bit of discussion on moral disengagement. This is a term from Albert Bandura's research, and it refers to how people distance themselves from ethical responsibility by restructuring the meaning of their actions or omissions. But what if you apply moral disengagement not to action, but to remembrance? What if someone disengages from the emotional responsibility to remember, to feel, to testify to the emotional presence of someone lost? Then what you get is a kind of silence that isn't passive, it's strategic. And maybe it's worth thinking about cognitive load theory too. When a person is under extreme stress, their working memory narrows. They can't hold a lot of emotional and logical information at the same time. So what tends to happen is that the brain defaults to the simpler track, logic. It's more containable. It doesn't overwhelm the system. So when asked about a deeply triggering topic, some people will just revert to what is knowable, not what is feelable. She was gone is knowable. I miss her is feelable. Guess which one requires less cognitive strain? And while we're at it, let's briefly consider object permanence and continuity. For children especially, the idea of gone can be literal. If someone isn't present, they're simply not part of the scene anymore. No emotional residue, no symbolic presence, just absence. It's a kind of primitive coping, a concrete representation of loss that doesn't require emotional reckoning. If that mode of thinking is never updated or challenged, it can carry into adulthood. And what you get is a person who continues to think, if they're not here, they're nowhere. So they're not in the drawing. We can't skip the idea of emotional scripting either. Some families teach you what you're allowed to feel, or at least what you're allowed to say out loud. If a family culture emphasizes strength, normalcy, or public image, then expressing longing or grief might not be modeled. So when the moment comes to describe something difficult, the person doesn't know how. Not because they're hiding something necessarily, but because the script was never written for them. Let's come back around to deductive reasoning. From a logical standpoint, Burke's rationale is perfectly consistent. She was gone, so she wasn't drawn. It's a closed syllogism. Premise A, premise B, conclusion. But what it lacks is emotional granularity. In human terms, logic isn't enough to explain absence. Most people leave room for the irrational, the symbolic, the sentimental. The fact that his drawing didn't shows a tightness of thought that isn't just logical, it's rigid. Also think about what kind of emotional vocabulary was modeled around him. If the people closest to him spoke in calculated terms, in neat explanations, and crisis management language, then of course his speech would mirror that. We all absorb the emotional cadence of our surroundings. And when the environment prizes control over catharsis, then the most appropriate answer becomes the most contained one. That answer, she was gone. And here's a philosophical question. What does it mean to memorialize someone in silence? Is it possible that omission itself is the memorial, that not speaking about someone is a way of preserving their sanctity, their memory, their peace? Maybe. And finally, let's bring in the internal narrative model. Every person walks around with a story in their head about who they are and what has happened to them. And when we tell stories, we reveal not just what we know, but how we've integrated it. Burke's version of events doesn't include JonBenet emotionally. That's not just a sentence. That's a worldview in which what's gone is gone and what's left is all that matters. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the real silence begins. 2. Interpretations and theories surrounding the omission. The omission of JonBenet from Burke's drawing has been a point of significant discussion and varied interpretations. In the Burke Dr. Phil transcript 1, observations leaked to the press were highlighted, suggesting it was unusual that Burke appeared to feel safe, displayed little warmth toward his family, and showed an enormous lack of emotion and almost an indifference, leading some to believe he had difficulty opening up about the family, similar to children who feel that there are things they shouldn't say. These observations were connected to his drawing of only his living family members and his reported statement of getting on with life. However, Burke, reflecting on the video, expressed that he looked like a normal kid and that his reserved personality might explain his demeanor. One speaker in the Burke Dr. Phil transcript 1-inch offered an alternative interpretation, suggesting Burke simply drew a picture of his family. He did exactly that, Mom, Dad, and Burke, because that's the only family he had when he was asked to draw the picture, and questioned the inference that he excluded JonBenet because he killed her. Burke also conveyed a sense of awkwardness regarding the questions about his sister's death, stating, "I think I felt a little awkward talking about it, and I think it was just something that I thought everyone knew. And so it's like, why are you asking me about this again?" However, the Burke Ramsey versus CBS lawsuit details how the CBS documentary, The Case of JonBenet Ramsey, allegedly used this drawing in Burke's interview excerpts to portray him as a lying sociopath who killed JonBenet. The lawsuit claims that pseudo-experts within the documentary, whom it describes as unqualified, interpreted Burke's tone as completely off and implied he lacked concern for his sister or his own safety, fabricating an implication that Burke felt safe because he was the killer. The lawsuit further asserts that the documentary knowingly and falsely implied that Burke's lack of a more emotional response was evidence of his guilt. It also points out that comments from Judith Phillips, a Ramsey critic who allegedly had no first-hand knowledge, were spliced into the documentary to claim Burke had a bad temper and once hit JonBenet with a golf club, aiming to suggest he could have killed her in a fit of rage. The lawsuit contends that these interpretations, along with accusations of scatological behavior, were used to suggest Burke suffered from psychological problems. Importantly, Burke Ramsey versus CBS highlights that even James Kolar, a source the documentary relied on for its Burke did it theory, admitted that such behavioral indicators were highly speculative and insufficient to prove involvement. And we can continue to think about how the absence of reminiscence reflects a deeper emotional freeze. Like if you notice, there's no "I remember when" or "we used to" or even "things changed after." That whole narrative string that normally connects a person to their past relationships, it's not just quiet here, it's cut. When people don't reminisce at all, and especially when they don't signal that they want to avoid the memory, it tells you something. Not necessarily guilt, but definitely control, emotional control, the kind where remembering is too slippery, too risky, so it's kept locked in a mental safe. Only facts stay out. And then, if we look at how the brain deals with loss, especially in youth, we start to see some physiological scaffolding for this. The amygdala, which processes emotions like fear and sadness, communicates with the hippocampus where memories get stored and retrieved, but under stress or emotional overload, that connection doesn't always work smoothly. For someone who's been through something hard, especially without resolution, there can be this strange rerouting. The memory doesn't evoke feeling anymore, it just exists as data, like a cold file in the cabinet. And when you're young, you may not even realize that happened. And we can also think about how most people crave shared reflection and how tellingly that's missing here. When someone's been through a big family loss, they usually reach for those moments that feel safe. They might say, "She used to make us laugh," or "Holidays haven't been the same." Not because it fixes anything, but because it honors the relational piece. It reaffirms the connection. When Burke avoids that completely, it's not just what he's not saying, it's that he doesn't seem to be seeking connection to her, not even symbolically. That's what lands so strangely. It's not sadness, it's void. And along the same lines, think about how memory works socially, not just internally. We tell stories to keep people alive in our heads, but also to show others who they were to us. That's what's missing here, not just grief, but witness. He doesn't speak of who she was, what she did, how she lived in his world. That's what memory usually does. It wraps identity and emotion together. But when the memory is sterile, the identity part gets lost too. And that's why this kind of language stands out in a forensic setting. Because the social part of the loss, how we communicate it, becomes part of the evidence. In addition to that, we've got to think about how suppressed grief doesn't just fade, it redirects. Grief that can't find expression somewhere often goes underground, and it shows up in other ways, maybe in a blank affect, maybe in strict rationality, maybe in odd fixations. And what's fascinating is how some people double down on logic when they don't know how to express what's underneath. So instead of saying, "I don't know how to feel," they just say, "It is what it is." But that doesn't mean there's nothing there. It means they've chosen a safer, more repeatable script. And we can continue to think about how drawing the family without her might reflect more than exclusion. It might reflect an identity reshuffle. You have to consider, when someone removes a figure from their internal landscape, they're not just ignoring the person, they're repositioning themselves. They're saying, "This is who I am now." And if that new identity is built without reference to someone once close, then we have to ask why. Is it because remembering threatens the new identity? Is it because memory contradicts the narrative being held up in the present? That's when this turns from neutral absence into potential self-protection. And then there's this whole thing in psychoanalysis called object relations theory. In layman's terms, this is the idea that the way we see people in our heads, our internal objects, shapes how we process relationships. So when someone doesn't show any emotional representation of someone who's gone, it might mean that internal object was too conflicted, maybe too painful, maybe too chaotic. So the person just deletes it from the internal narrative. Doesn't mean they didn't care. Sometimes it means they cared too much and couldn't tolerate the mismatch between memory and reality. Let's also touch on the criminological lens of narrative identity construction. In a lot of forensic interviews, especially with people close to a case, professionals look not just at what someone says, but how they structure their story. Is the narrative internally consistent? Does it center themselves as a victim, a bystander, a protector, or something else? Burke doesn't tell a story that includes himself in relation to her. That's huge because it removes him from the emotional consequences. And that lack of narrative entanglement often suggests a deep need to disconnect self from event. And if we consider memory in the context of disruption, the gaps themselves become significant. Think of memory like a thread that weaves through time. If someone's story jumps over a key piece, especially someone's life or death, then the cut in the thread has to be explained, not necessarily to others, but to themselves. And when they can't explain it emotionally, they sometimes delete it. They treat it like a skipped chapter. But in doing that, they remove not just the event, but the feelings that should have surrounded it. And that's what comes across as cold, even if it's not meant to. Another related idea is that some people reconstruct their reality to preserve emotional equilibrium. This isn't about lying, it's about maintenance. Cognitive maintenance. If remembering someone stirs up questions or contradictions that can't be reconciled, it's often easier to just not remember them in meaningful ways. That sounds counterintuitive, but it's actually common. In clinical psychology, this shows up when clients speak of people in their past without any descriptive markers, no adjectives, no scenes, no attachments, just names, like line items. And that's exactly how JonBenet is referenced here. And we can keep building on this by looking at attachment theory, especially disorganized attachment. Without diving too deep into jargon, let's just say this. People with unstable attachment patterns sometimes express loss not as longing, but as avoidance. It's a kind of nervous system short circuit. They don't know how to hold both the love and the confusion at the same time, so they drop one. And usually the one that gets dropped is the one they don't know how to explain. So you'll hear, she was gone, instead of, I loved her and I didn't know how to handle what happened. Let's swing it a little toward philosophical terrain and think about the ethics of remembering. In some circles, it's argued that remembering isn't just emotional, it's moral. That to remember someone with complexity, with honesty, even with discomfort, is a kind of ethical obligation. And when that doesn't happen, when someone refuses to carry the memory, even lightly, it raises questions. Is it too painful? Is it too tangled? Or is there something about the memory itself that disturbs the current identity the person is trying to maintain? And while we're on the topic of ethics, let's also nod to the principle of moral presence. That's the idea that someone's memory, especially someone close, should remain in your moral field, even after they're gone. Most people, consciously or not, let that presence linger. They hear their voice, remember their habits, hold space for them in family stories. But here, we don't see that. There's no memory echo, no verbal trace. And that, philosophically speaking, disrupts the usual structure of familial continuity. We can also dig into something forensic psychologists call dissociative omission. This is a tendency where someone's mind blanks out emotionally loaded information, not always in a full memory loss sense, but more like an editing tool. It deletes the emotional charge, but keeps the headline. She was gone is the headline. What's missing is all the subtext, all the sensory details, all the feeling markers. And that kind of omission isn't random, it's protective. The brain basically says you can keep this one sentence, but you're not allowed to feel what goes with it. And continuing from that idea, what might be worth exploring is how some people treat emotional reflection as a liability. They don't trust what might come out if they go there. So instead of risking emotional exposure, they clamp it down with flatness. That's not always malicious. Sometimes it's survival logic. But in a situation like this, where emotional recollection would be expected, the absence of it starts to take on its own forensic texture. It becomes something to examine in its own right, not just as a missing piece, but as a possible strategy. And you know what's interesting is how tone can tell on the psyche even when the words seem neutral. Burke's delivery, assuming you're listening to interviews, isn't just about what he says, it's about how he says it. Cadence, pitch, rhythm. And what you find is a tight control, not just over emotion, but over vulnerability. And when someone's tone is flat in all the wrong places, not tired, not robotic, just blank, that's when the forensic linguists start mapping tone against timeline, because tone can betray discomfort, even when the content is airtight. We should also consider how the omission of memory aligns with patterns seen in clinical avoidance. In therapeutic work, avoidance isn't just dodging a topic, it's the construction of an entire worldview that allows you never to approach the topic at all. And often, that worldview includes rationalizations. She's gone. There's no point talking about it. It's the past. These statements sound mature, even stoic, but they're often scaffolding for fragility, for unprocessed internal states that would collapse the structure if they were acknowledged too directly. And what's funny about this pattern is how it often looks like strength. People will say, he seems composed, or he's accepted it. But what they're really seeing is restriction. The person is holding something tightly, not letting it spill, not letting it ripple. That kind of emotional compression can masquerade as maturity. But underneath, it's more like fear wearing a business suit. Controlled language doesn't always come from control. Sometimes it comes from containment, and that's a whole different animal. Now here's a thought experiment. What if the silence is a kind of confession, not a confession of wrongdoing, but a confession of disconnection, a way of saying, I don't feel this, or I can't feel this, or I've made peace with not feeling this. That's a kind of statement too. And in forensic psychology, it's not always what's said that matters. It's what the psyche is trying not to process out loud. Silence speaks, especially when it keeps showing up. And lastly, let's dip into the idea of narrative safety zones. People construct safe zones in their stories, the parts they'll talk about easily, the parts they won't touch. When someone's entire recollection of a sibling ends at a sentence with no reflective layers, what they're telling you is, this is my line, I won't cross it. And when you see where someone draws their line, you start to get a sense of what they fear lies beyond it. And that line is what gives the story its forensic weight, or into evidentiary weight, and the risks of overinterpretation regarding the evidentiary weight of such psychological observations. The sources present strong arguments against their reliability and the risks of overinterpretation, particularly in a legal context. The Burke Ramsey versus CBS lawsuit vehemently argues that the psychological interpretations presented in the CBS documentary were based on pseudosciences, and that the pseudo-experts were totally unqualified to perform a psychological analysis of a child based on a video interview, emphasizing that no legitimate psychologist would render any opinions based on experts from such an interview. Crucially, the lawsuit highlights that both the Boulder Police Department and Child Social Services, after their interviews with Burke on December 26, 1996, and January 8, 1997, were convinced that Burke did not know what has happened to his sister and did not witness his sister's murder. This directly contradicts the speculative interpretations offered by others. Furthermore, Burke Ramsey versus CBS underscores that law enforcement authorities have repeatedly and publicly exonerated Burke. Former Boulder PD Chief Mark Beckner stated in early 1998 that Burke was not involved in the killing of JonBenet, was not a suspect, and was not being looked at as a suspect. Former Boulder District Attorney Alex Hunter issued a press statement in May 1999, publicly and officially stating that Burke was not a suspect. Later, in 2008, former Boulder DA Mary Lacey, citing newly discovered DNA evidence, released an open letter stating that the Ramsey family, including Burke, was not to be under any suspicion in the crime. The lawsuit maintains that no evidence existed to support a finding that Burke killed his sister, and that no evidence suggesting Burke's involvement in JonBenet's death has ever been discovered, and because he is innocent, does not exist. The lawsuit accuses the CBS documentary of knowingly disregarding and failing to disclose these law enforcement conclusions, characterizing the documentary's portrayal as a fraudulent charade. In the Burke Dr. Phil transcript 1, Burke himself expressed the frustration of being treated as a suspect despite the lack of evidence. He stated that after the grand jury concluded with no charges filed against him, he was told he didn't have anything to do with it, a conclusion he found obvious, remarking, kind of like, well, duh. In the r_JonBenet Ramsey wiki_Burke Ramsey interview, Burke also recalled how a police interview, which occurred during his exam week and he couldn't attend immediately, was later blown up into this huge news story, illustrating how his actions were publicized and potentially misinterpreted by the media. This highlights the concern that psychological observations, especially from a child, are highly susceptible to overinterpretation and manipulation, particularly when detached from other concrete evidence or official conclusions. And we can continue to think about how this entire exchange relies on logic that feels a little too clean for real life. There's something about saying she was gone so I didn't draw her that sounds tidy, almost like he's tying a bow on something that's never actually been opened. In real-world grief, especially in the context of family, things are messy. People do irrational things, include lost loved ones in drawings, speak about them in the present tense, or get stuck trying to remember their voice. But this wasn't that. This was decisive, precise, like a math problem that was solved instead of a wound that was processed. That's not how most people operate, and that's what catches attention. And let's also think about what deductive reasoning usually looks like when it's part of genuine reflection. So typically, when people are explaining something emotional using logic, their reasoning still has little emotional leaks. Things like, I figured it wouldn't make sense, but it still felt weird. Or, I knew she wasn't there, but part of me wanted to include her anyway. But that's not what happened here. What we got instead was this rigid linear formula. Person is gone equals person is not pictured. No inner conflict, no pushback from memory, and that lack of friction between reason and feeling is what creates unease. And we can continue this line of thought by exploring the role of emotional contradiction. Most people live in a state of emotional contradiction, especially after loss. They say things like, I know it's been years, but I still catch myself setting a place for them. Or, sometimes I forget they're not still here. That's normal. That's the emotional brain and logical brain bumping into each other. But Burke's statement lacks that entirely. It's clean, clinical, no contradiction. And that, ironically, is the contradiction because it doesn't reflect real emotional processing. And if we pivot slightly, we can think about what that means in terms of forensic modeling. In forensic psychology, there's a concept called flattened cognitive emotional response. What that really means is when someone offers a rational account of something emotionally intense, but their explanation has no emotional texture. It's not just about tone, it's about the lack of contradiction, the lack of moral hesitation, the absence of any kind of metaphorical language that people often default to when explaining something they felt more than they understood. And this brings us into a deeper point about the physiological sequencing of how the brain handles cognition versus emotion. Here's the thing. The amygdala, responsible for fear and emotional salience, activates first. It's primitive and fast, but the prefrontal cortex, which handles logic and executive function, comes later. In emotionally laden memory, you often see this mismatch where people say things like, "I couldn't think straight," or "I was too overwhelmed to explain." But Burke's narrative doesn't show that sequence. It jumps straight to prefrontal cortex reasoning. And in context involving emotionally charged memories, that reversal of natural sequencing feels off. We should also consider how this connects to what's called narrative compression. That's when someone removes unnecessary parts of a story, not for clarity, but for containment. It's different from just being concise. It's about surgically removing anything that might make the memory feel real again. And if you think about it, "She was gone, so I didn't draw her" is the ultimate compressed sentence. It's not just lacking emotion, it's lacking sequence. There's no beginning, middle, end. It's just conclusion. It's the final line with no buildup. And what's also worth noting is how this kind of statement sidesteps emotional risk entirely. That's the clever part. It doesn't invite further questions. It doesn't say, "This is hard to talk about," which someone might follow up on. It says, "This was a factual decision," which ends the conversation. It's like a conversational cul-de-sac. And if we're talking about psychological strategy, that's a tactic. Whether it's conscious or unconscious, it's a way of avoiding vulnerability by offering a closed loop. We can also think about how his response bypasses the concept of felt presence. This is something people talk about when a loved one is gone but still emotionally present. People might say, "I still feel her with me," or "I imagine what she'd say." These aren't hallucinations, they're psychological continuity mechanisms. They're how we hold on to attachment. But Burke doesn't reference any of that. His reasoning suggests that once someone is no longer physically present, they no longer hold emotional weight. That's not typical. That's philosophical detachment. Now, if we explore the criminological philosophy behind neutral reasoning, we get into some really complex territory. There's this idea in philosophical criminology that neutral explanations, especially around emotionally charged situations, are often used to restructure one's moral proximity to the event. It's like saying, "I didn't do anything wrong," but in a much quieter, less noticeable way. It's about building distance, not just from actions, but from emotional association. And in forensic interviews, analysts look for these subtle repositionings, not because they're proof of anything, but because they suggest a psychological motive to self-preserve. And we can dig a bit into the concept of bounded rationality from decision theory. Bounded rationality is the idea that people don't always make the best decision, they make the best decision they can within the limits of what they know and feel. But the thing is, even within that, people often override rationality with emotion. That's why people make illogical choices when grief is involved. So when Burke sticks to a purely bounded logic, "person is gone, person is excluded," it shows not just cold reasoning, but an absence of competing emotional logic. Let's also touch on the way memory encoding is influenced by stress physiology. When the brain is under stress, it actually encodes memories differently. Instead of rich multisensory memories, it sometimes lays down only fragments, visuals without emotion, facts without context. That's called fragmented encoding, and it's common in high stress environments. Now, if we see someone recalling an event with minimal affect and flat structure, it could be because the memory was encoded without emotional scaffolding to begin with. Or it could be that the scaffolding was later dismantled through rehearsal and repetition of a safe version. And while we're talking about encoding, let's think about rehearsal. Rehearsed language becomes second nature. When someone repeats a version of events often enough, especially one that's emotionally neutral, they stop needing to access the raw memory. They access the script. And the thing with scripts is that they don't adapt to the room, they don't respond to new questions, and they don't vary in tone. So when you hear someone repeat the same phrasing, "she was gone," with no evolution over time, you start to ask, how often was this version practiced and what did it replace? And let's go one layer deeper into the psychology of rehearsal as a defense mechanism. Rehearsal isn't just about preparing to speak, it's about controlling the uncontrollable. If a person has created a version of a memory that protects them from emotion, they'll defend that version at all costs. That's why you often see a mismatch between what someone is saying and what they won't say. They're not lying, they're protecting the container. And sometimes the logic they offer is what holds that container shut. We can also look at the forensic concept of emotional leakage. It's when small cues, voice tremble, sudden word shifts, contradictory statements, leak out emotion that the person doesn't intend to show. But Burke's presentation lacks those leaks. No nervous laughter, no shifting pronouns, no rephrasing. It's tight. And in forensic interviews, a lack of emotional leakage doesn't necessarily suggest guilt, but it does raise the question of whether the emotion was ever there or whether it's been so contained that the system doesn't allow it to show up. And what's interesting about that is how it plays into the broader philosophical tension between control and chaos. Philosophically speaking, people try to impose order on emotional chaos. We make routines, we tell stories, we write songs, all to shape things that feel uncontainable. But when that shaping becomes too effective, when the control is too perfect, it starts to feel unnatural, like something is being suppressed instead of metabolized. And that's the tension here. His logic is so orderly, so unflinching, that it stops feeling human. We should also consider the idea of symbolic erasure as a form of distancing. Symbolic erasure happens when someone removes another person from their mental or visual landscape in order to maintain emotional safety. In drawings, in stories, in photos, it's a distancing mechanism. Yes, but also a reframing one. By redrawing the family without her, it's not just that she's excluded, it's that the family has moved on without her. That's a statement. Whether intentional or not, it sends a message that continuity has been preserved at the expense of memory. And as we keep peeling layers, we also land in the space of emotional strategy. Most people don't think of emotions as strategic, but they are, especially in high-stakes environments. People learn to show what's rewarded and suppress what's dangerous. So if, over time, someone learns that expressing grief, confusion, or conflict leads to uncomfortable attention, they might start answering only with facts, only with conclusions. And what might look like maturity or numbness is actually a long pattern of emotional economizing. Now, if we step into the mind of someone who may be trying to project control, the logic becomes part of the identity. They start to need the narrative to be logical, because if it starts to get messy, then their own position becomes unstable, and people protect their internal role in a story fiercely. So maybe it's not about what's being said, it's about who they're trying to be. And that person, the one who's clear, composed, unaffected, is much easier to maintain than someone vulnerable to recollection. And then there's the behavioral pattern of linguistic minimalism. Minimalism in language isn't always about being concise. It can be about dodging complexity. The fewer the words, the fewer the implications. It's a subtle strategy, but it shows up when people don't want to engage in layered meaning, because layered meaning requires vulnerability. And when vulnerability is off limits, logic becomes the safe house. And one last thing to note here is how logic can sometimes act as a decoy. It gives people something to grab onto, something to nod along with. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. But making sense and being whole are different things. Something can make logical sense and still feel emotionally bankrupt. And in forensic settings, that's often what flags a narrative as worth examining. Not because it's dishonest, but because it's too perfect. And perfection in emotional narratives isn't natural. It's sculpted. And that's what we're left holding. Not just a sentence, but a sculpture of silence. Okay, let's take a few things a little further that we've talked about thus far and go deeper into some of the core points. So one of the first things we really have to unpack is that phrase, she was gone, so I didn't draw her. That's not just a sentence, it's a mental shortcut. It's clean, it's transactional. But life, especially life after someone dies, isn't that clean. There's usually some residue left behind. Emotional residue, symbolic gestures, involuntary habits. So when someone doesn't express any of that and doesn't even hint at it, we've got to ask, is that repression? Is that denial? Or is that recalibration? And what's interesting is that it might be all three wrapped into one. And if we think about the tone of the statement, it's not even that it's indifferent, it's that it's neutralized. That's the thing. He's not angrily dismissing her. He's not mourning her. He's not reminiscing about her. He's treating her absence like a spreadsheet cell, blank and unreferenced. And that's where we hit the technical idea of emotional flattening. In psychology, this is when emotional expression becomes limited, muted, or totally stripped down, not because there's nothing there, but because it's being suppressed or bypassed. And it can happen consciously or unconsciously, especially in people who've been under long-term stress. So what we're seeing may not be emotional absence, but emotional rerouting. And that brings us to the limbic system. Real quick, the limbic system is the part of your brain that processes emotional intensity, while the prefrontal cortex is the part that organizes and filters it. When someone is overwhelmed or taught to suppress emotional response early on, their brain might start bypassing the limbic system and going straight to logic. So instead of I miss her, you get she was gone. It's not that the brain didn't register the pain. It's that it categorized it differently to avoid overload. And on that same path, let's think about what it means when someone uses symbolic logic instead of emotional reflection. Drawings, for example, are highly symbolic, especially for kids. They don't just show you what's there, they show you who matters, and not just in a conscious way. Even adults, when doodling or sketching out family members, tend to insert people who've passed if those people still feel emotionally present. So when someone chooses not to include a person, that's not just omission, that's a statement. It says they are no longer part of this version of reality. I'm acknowledging. And then you've got to look at the lack of conflict in his explanation, which is maybe the most glaring part. Like there's no, I wasn't sure if I should, or it felt weird not to draw her. There's no emotional wrestling at all. That's where forensic linguistics comes into play. Because when people recall emotional events without any struggle, it doesn't always mean they're lying, but it does mean they're either emotionally disconnected or they've rehearsed the answer so many times that the emotional volatility has been drained out. Either way, it points to a deeper structure behind the response. Now, what's also interesting is how the absence of reflection shows a complete removal of relational context. Normally, even if someone avoids deep emotional language, they'll still acknowledge the relationship. Something like, I remember how she used to bother me, but I kind of miss it now. That shows you the tie still exists, even if it's buried. But here, it's severed. There's no anecdote, no personal memory, no she and I structure. That's not just detachment, that's self-preservation in its most discrete form. And what might be worth thinking about next is the concept of psychological distance as an adaptive tool. People adapt to high-stress environments by creating mental space between themselves and whatever they can't manage emotionally. They create buffers. So when someone's response is filtered through factual observation, she was gone rather than reflective memory, I think about her all the time, you're seeing that distance play out. It's a kind of mental insulation, keeps everything sealed, neat, undisturbed. But the funny thing is, that kind of insulation eventually makes people seem overly composed. And that's where things get muddy, because now outsiders are looking at that calm as suspicious. Like, how are you not more shaken? But from the inside, it's a trained stillness. That's why it's so hard to interpret. People who've built internal systems to manage stress often sound flat, not because they don't feel, but because their emotional system got rewired. And honestly, that's not uncommon in families that experience public crises. Another layer to this is the philosophical idea of erasure as control. If someone doesn't want to feel powerless in a situation, they may start erasing the pieces they can't control. And this is where we start playing with narrative construction. By not including JonBenet in the drawing, it might not have been about forgetting her. It might have been about reclaiming power over the version of life that was being redrawn. And that's where we get into deeper waters because that kind of behavior doesn't scream malice, it screams fracture. And we can't forget how that fracture shows up through linguistic minimalism. Minimalist responses aren't always about being brief. Sometimes they're about being inaccessible. Like, if I give you the least emotional version of the truth, you can't ask me more about it. That's a form of conversational shutdown. And that's what She Was Gone does. It offers a conclusion that bypasses engagement. And that's where the strategy sits, not necessarily to mislead, but to avoid the weight of being interpreted. Now, if we get technical for a second and talk about bounded rationality, there's a neat parallel here. Bounded rationality basically says that people make the best decision they can given what they know and feel in that moment. So let's say Burke genuinely didn't know how to express what he felt. Let's say he had no access to emotional language. Then his logical response was his best possible answer, not because it was deep, but because it was all he could access. That's something we often overlook. People aren't always hiding things. Sometimes they're just under-equipped to tell you what they're feeling. And let's go a little deeper into memory suppression because this one's tricky. When someone suppresses a memory, not erase it, but compartmentalize it, they start accessing it through filters. Over time, the raw memory fades and only the filter remains. That's how someone ends up giving you a version of a story that's so flat it almost feels suspicious. But it's not necessarily invented, it's just decontaminated. And people do that without even realizing it, especially if the original memory came with confusion or shame. And getting inside the mind of someone who uses logic to manage the unmanageable, there's a whole inner calculation happening. They're weighing what they can say versus what they're willing to relive. And more often than not, they'll choose the emotionally distant path because it feels safer, not more accurate, just more containable. And over time, that becomes their default mode. That's where we get into identity. When someone has used logic as a survival mechanism long enough, it becomes their emotional language. And here's the philosophical kicker. Silence itself becomes a narrative. That's where people get confused. They think silence means nothing, but silence always says something. It says, I'm avoiding, or I'm protecting, or I'm refusing. And sometimes it even says, I've rewritten this in a way I can live with. So when Burke doesn't speak of her, it might not be absence, it might be designed, not storytelling, not confession, just containment. And that's what makes it so hard to decode. And finally, what we're left with isn't a tidy answer, but a psychological echo. It's not about proving anything. It's about noticing the gaps, the lack of remembrance, the emotional minimalism, the symbolic exclusions. These things aren't conclusions on their own, but they form a pattern that says there's something in this story that got folded away. And maybe that something isn't what he did, but what he couldn't or wouldn't allow himself to feel. That's where the emotional math gets complicated. That's where the real story hides, not in the drawing, but in the blank space where the drawing should have said more. All right, so coming out of all that, what we're really left with isn't clarity, it's contrast. The contrast between what we'd expect someone to express about a sibling who's no longer here and what we actually got, a brief, emotionally vacant statement sitting at the intersection of logic and avoidance. Whether Burke's response was self-protective, conditioned, or simply an artifact of how he processes experience, it's the surrounding silence that really tells the story. That absence of warmth, of conflict, of shared memory, it all builds up, not to accuse, but to suggest something deeper is being managed beneath the surface. And maybe that's the thing worth sitting with, because when someone skips over memory, they're not just omitting facts, they're rerouting identity, they're redrawing the story they live inside. And if that story has no room for the sibling they lost, then it's fair to ask whether it was a choice, a defense, or a trained behavior. None of those answers are easy, but that doesn't make the question any less necessary. It's also important to recognize that we're not diagnosing here. We're interpreting a pattern, and patterns don't lie, even when people do. If someone constantly chooses control over vulnerability, logic over reflection, and silence over symbolism, you can start to see the architecture of their internal world. Not to accuse them of anything, but to understand how their emotional system is wired, especially when that wiring shows up in places where emotion would normally live. What's funny and maybe tragic is how quickly people assume that emotional distance means nothing happened. But sometimes it means too much happened, too much to process, too much to feel. And the only way through is to seal it off, build a new map, and draw the family all over again, minus the part that brings too many questions. It's that redraw that's telling, not because of who's in it, but because of who isn't, and how no one seems to be reaching for them anymore. So as we close this out, we're not walking away with a solution. We're walking away with a sharper sense of what silence can do, how absence can speak, and how logic, while useful, can sometimes become the perfect hiding place for everything we're afraid to admit. That's the shadow we've been tracing here, not what was said, but what was strategically left unsaid. And I'll stop it right there, but I want to say thanks for your love and support. Hope you are doing well. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And until the next time, take it easy.